I hate to break up good fellowship, but it is time for us to begin. If you'll find somewhere to light, then we will get in on Revelation chapter 4. Revelation chapter 4. We got into a little bit of Revelation 4 at the end of class last week, but we're going to spend a little bit more time. The very first few words, I mentioned this last week, after this I looked, and I've got just a few up to chapter 13 when I run out of room on that slide. But there's more than that. But you'll see this phrase over and over, after this I look, or then I saw, or now I watched, or something like that. It's kind of the hint that we're moving on to another movie. Remember, we talked about how that these visions that John is seeing is maybe best thought of, put it in 21st century terminology. It's kind of like watching a movie. You watch a movie for a little bit, and then you turn the channel, and there's another movie you can watch, and you turn the channel, and there's another movie, and you know, sometimes it's even like you'll turn on, there'll be a movie, and then you'll turn to another channel, and it's the same movie that's been remade in a different way. Well, that's kind of what some of these visions are like. The only difference is usually the remakes in real life aren't as good as the original movie, and these are all just as good that John's going to tell us about. So anyway, that's the way that it makes best sense to me. But these different places throughout, you'll see these different ideas that tells you this is a marking of a new vision or a new segment or something of that nature. And where, if you went out to the Sine Theater and looked at what was now showing, what's now showing is the reigning God from chapter 4 and coming soon. I'm not sure how soon it's coming because I'm afraid we're going to get interrupted by the Wednesday night summer series. I almost mixed that up. Wednesday night summer series before we get to that movie. So it may be like one of those where like, I just can't wait till that movie comes out. We may have to wait a few months before that movie comes out, but we'll get there eventually. But the reigning God is what we're looking at. And if you have a Bible with you, besides the little workbooks, and by the way, I had someone ask tonight, if you don't have one of these little workbooks, we've got plenty of them out back. In fact, if you'll raise your hand if you need one, I'm sure I can get Josh or somebody to go out there and pick one up for anybody. But it just has the text on one side of Revelation, and then it's empty on the other side, so you can take as many notes as you want. Or you can do like Daddy does. Daddy lets Mama take a bunch of notes, and then he lets her write the notes into his notebook. I don't know if that's how they made it through school. I don't know. Anyway, that's what they do here. Yeah, better than, yeah. So anyway, if you got a Bible with you, you can be turning over to the Old Testament, to the book of Exodus. We're going to look at a few places tonight that helps us. You know, we talked about at the very beginning of the book of Revelation in our introductory material, we talked about the fact that there's some things one of the things that I think scares us about Revelation is there's all the time people saying, well, this represents this, and this represents this, and this represents that. And most of those are good thoughts sometimes. Sometimes they're not good thoughts, but a lot of times it's just thoughts, and it's not anything that we can. There's sometimes where he tells us, like in chapter 12, that the dragon is Satan. And so guess what the dragon represents? Satan, the devil, that's right. But we know that because the text tells us. But then there's a lot of times I think we try to find like every little thing represents something, and every little thing doesn't always represent something. Sometimes, even though it may sound like way out there to us because we've never seen anything like that, whenever it sounds outlandish, we automatically want to say, well, this must be this represents this, or it represents something. But sometimes there's a pattern that you can see throughout the Bible where different individuals have seen the same exact thing. And if they've seen the same thing every time, maybe they describe it a little differently, but if they're basically seeing the same thing, then that would tell us that's not anything that's like some sort of representation. That's what it is, you know. So anyway, we started talking about that a little bit last week, but in chapter 4 and verse 1, he says, "After this I looked," and there's our phrase, "and behold, a door standing open in heaven." That word standing is not really there. It's been added in the translation. So it's a door open in heaven, which is kind of like what he said in Ezekiel chapter 1 and verse 1, which we'll go back and read here in just a minute. But that's the idea of what's going on here. He says, "This first voice which I had heard speaking to me like a trumpet," that was back in Revelation 1, verses 10 through 12, said, "Come up here and I'll show you what must take place after this." And of course in Revelation 1 and verse 1, he said these are all things that must happen soon. They're going to take place in a relatively short period of time in perspective of world history. And so that's what we're getting into when we get that. Well, again, in Ezekiel chapter 1 and verse 1 is that phrase, "the heavens were opened." So when Ezekiel is standing down by the river and he looks up at the sky and he says, "There's the heavens have opened up and I can see something." And John is on this island, Patmos, and he looks up and the heavens are opened and he sees something. So that sounds like the same thing, right? And so this idea of being in the Spirit that he's going to talk about in a minute is this visionary state that he's in. But this is really beginning the main visionary part of all of this, and what he sees is that what he hears, he says, is this voice that was speaking to him that sounded like a trumpet. Well, in chapter 1, we talked about how that was Jesus, the glorified Son of God. And he says, "Come up here, and I'm going to show you the things that must soon take place." And that "come up here" reminds us of kind of what God said to Moses in Exodus chapter 19 when he told him to come up here on the mountain, and he was going to show him some things. And then in verse 2, we read last week there at the end of class, but "At once I was in the Spirit, and behold, a throne stood in heaven, and one seated on the throne." So I'm in the Spirit. I am in some way kind of a prophetic ecstasy. In Ezekiel chapter 8, Ezekiel talks about, uses that same kind of phrase. In Ezekiel 37, he uses that same kind of phrase. It's kind of like... remember in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, Paul talks about this man that was called up to the third heavens in the Spirit. Well, that man was probably Paul, of course, but that idea is I think what he's talking about here. They're in the Spirit so that they can see this vision that he wants them to see, with one seated on the throne, and that would be God the Father, as we'll point out here in just a minute. And he who sat there had the appearance of jasper. And this word that's translated jasper is just a word that means stone. If you're reading from a different translation, you may have something different, but it's kind of a generic word. It can be used, sometimes it's used to talk about stones, building stones, like we might say a cinder block or a brick or something like that. It's also sometimes used to talk about precious stones, like diamonds or jasper stones, or whatever it might be. And then he says he had the appearance of jasper and carnelian, and that's a word that in the original language just means a reddish colored rock, but again probably a precious stone that was a reddish color. There was actually a kind of granite that when I was working at the monument shop we would get that came from South Dakota, and that was the trade name. It was kind of mahogany reddish brown. That was the trade name for it, was carnelian. And anyway, that's the idea, is a reddish kind of deal. And around the throne, he says, the ESV says there was a rainbow that had the appearance of an emerald. The rainbow, some translations say a bow, some translations say a halo. The word just means a circle of light, and it could be talking about a halo that's bright and not colored, just a white light. It could be talking about a rainbow like we see in the sky. I don't know. John's just trying his best to describe what he's seeing here, and we've got to use our imagination a little bit. But he says this bow or this halo or whatever it is had the appearance of an emerald, and this is a Greek word that means emerald. So if you think about the Emerald City on The Wizard of Oz, y'all watch The Wizard of Oz? Growing up, that was like Thanksgiving. It was probably more important than the turkey. We had to watch Wizard of Oz, and Daddy and Uncle Jimmy Freeman used to see who could call each other first and tell them what channel and what time it was coming on. But if you remember, when they're walking down that yellow brick road and they see the Emerald City, it's green, but it's kind of glowing. Well, that's the way, at least I picture this bow that whatever it was around him. So I'm not sure exactly what all these words mean and how accurately they are describing what he's seeing, but what I do know is that he's trying to describe the best he can something that was really, really pretty. And I have a feeling that he was having a hard time finding the words in human language to explain what he was seeing in the Spirit in that heavenly throne room, don't you? It's kind of like when we first moved out to Denver and we went up to the Rocky Mountains, and Bradley, my brother, called me a few days later. He'd seen he said, well, what's it like? And I'm trying to explain it to him, but I can't explain to him what it's like to be on top of a 14er. We don't have those around here. And he said, well, which is prettier, the Smoky Mountains or the Rocky Mountains? And I said, neither. They don't look anything alike. They're both beautiful in their own way, but you can't even compare the two, you know. I could try to explain it, but until you're up there and you see what it looks like up there, you're not really going to know what it's like to be at the top of a 14,000-foot mountain in the Rocky Mountains. And I couldn't make those people out west understand how beautiful it is to be on top of the Smoky Mountains and see trees everywhere, and especially in the fall with all the different colors and how pretty that is. We had Tyler King, when I was preaching at Eastwood, interned with us one summer, and he would go with me when we would make visits and different things, and he'd always lean forward, and he'd be looking like this, and I'd say, Tyler, what are you doing? And he'd say, I've never seen so many trees in my life, you know. Just wasn't used to it. It's hard to explain that if you've never seen it. Well, I think that's part of what John is struggling with here. So there's this throne in heaven, and there's someone sitting on this throne, kind of like in Daniel 7, the Ancient of Days he talks about that's sitting on the throne. But what I want us to do for just a few minutes is to look at, I left my Bible in my office, but we'll try to cipher through it best we can. I want us to go back in the Old Testament and look at some of these throne room scenes. And we looked at Exodus last week. We're going to look at it again for just a second in case there's somebody here that wasn't here last week. And then we'll get over to Ezekiel where we left off, and we'll spend a little bit more time talking about Ezekiel. But if you've got your workbooks there, keep that open, and you can look back and forth at Revelation 4 and see such similar terminology to what we're going to see in Exodus chapter 24. It seemed like the older I get, the smaller they make the print in these pew Bibles, isn't it? I don't know why that's the case. I guess inflation, I don't know. In Exodus chapter 24, this is when Moses goes up to see God. And if you look down in chapter 24 at verse 9, it says, Then Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel went up, and there they saw the God of Israel. There was under his feet, as it were, a pavement of sapphire stone, like the very heaven for clearness. Now, he didn't tell us a whole lot about here in Exodus 24, but he tells us a little bit that he's seeing God up there, and he's telling us that under his feet is asphalt that's clear. I've never seen clear asphalt, have you? I've been to places where they've, like a little walkway out above a big canyon, or maybe you've been to some of those big high-rise buildings in big cities where they have a glass floor and you walk and look down, and the whole time I'm wondering, I've seen a lot of broken glass in my day. I wonder how sturdy this is, you know. And then there's always somebody that wants to jump and see how sturdy it is, and you just want to punch them. That ain't very Christian, but anyway. So he's seeing this pavement that's clear. And then if you turn over to Ezekiel, in Ezekiel, we see him talking about his description of what he sees in his vision. And Ezekiel's over there in the major prophets right before you get to Daniel. You go through Isaiah and Jeremiah to get there, and then you'll get to Ezekiel. And in chapter 1 of Ezekiel, he talks about at the very beginning of it that when it was that all this is happening and where he's at. And then at the end of verse 1 of Ezekiel 1, he says, "The heavens were open, and I saw the visions of God," that we saw just a few minutes ago. And then if you look on down in verse 4, he says, "As I looked, behold, a stormy wind came out of the north, and a great cloud with brightness." Now that's one of the things you're going to notice in Revelation 1. He's already talked about how bright this all was, right? And in all these different visions, they're going to talk about that. There's fire flashing forth continually. Well, in Revelation 4, he's going to talk about the lightning and the thunder. And in the midst of the fire, as it were, gleaming or shining metal. And in the midst of it came the likeness of 4 living creatures. And John's going to talk about these 4 living creatures in Revelation as well. And we mentioned last week, before we got done with class, just how weird these 4 living creatures, their description was. He says that this was their appearance. They had a human likeness, so they kind of looked human, but they each had 4 faces, and each of them had 4 wings. Their legs were straight, and the soles of their feet were like the soles of a calf's foot. That's kind of weird, isn't it? And then it says they sparkled like burnished bronze. They were bright and shining. Under their wings, on their 4 sides, they had human hands, and the 4 had their faces and their wings thus. Their wings touched one another, each one of them straight forward without turning as they went. So you remember, like whenever they built the temple, the tabernacle, they had the Ark of the Covenant, had the cherubim, remember, with the wings, rather, that reached out and touched each other. Then when they built the big temple, they had these big, giant, on either side, in the Holy of Holies, on either side of the Ark of the Covenant, they had these big, giant statues. And their wings, I think it was like 30 foot apart or something like that. And their wings came together over the Ark of the Covenant and touched, which is what he's describing here. Then in verse 10 he says, "As for the likeness of their faces, each had a human face. The 4 had the face of a lion on the right side. The 4 had the face of an ox on the left side. The 4 had the face of an eagle. Such were their faces." Well, you've heard of somebody being 2-faced. How about 4-faced? And on one side it looks like a human, and on one side it's an ox face, and on one side it's a lion's face, and on the other side it's an eagle's face. Well, that's weird, isn't it? Like, if John showed up tonight teaching this for the first time, you'd say he's the one that moved here from Colorado, wouldn't you? You know, I mean, this is weird stuff that he's talking about. It's weird to us because we ain't seen these kind of things. And then he says, where was I at? Verse 11, "Such were their faces, their wings were spread out above. Each creature had 2 wings, each of when touched the wing of another, while 2 covered their bodies, and each went straight forward. Wherever the Spirit would go, they went, without turning as they went. So the Spirit's there, and wherever He goes, they're going, but they're not having to turn to get where they're going. He says, as for the likeness of the living creatures, their appearance was like burning coals of fire. You know what burning coals of fire does? It glows, doesn't it? Like the appearance of torches moving to and fro from the living creatures. And the fire was bright, and the fire went forth lightning, and the living creatures darted to and fro like the appearance of a flash of lightning. Now, as I looked at the living creatures, and you know, sometimes people will say, oh, look at that sweet, pretty little baby. She's just like a little cherubim. If somebody says your baby looks like a cherubim, you ought to punch them in the nose, because I'm thinking that they were not pretty things. Maybe they were, I don't know. As I looked at the living creatures, I saw a wheel on the earth beside the living creatures. Each of them, the four of them, so each one of them had a wheel beside them that was attached to this, evidently this pedestal that the throne was sitting on. And for the appearance of the wheels and their construction, their appearance was like the gleaming of beryl, and the four had the same likeness. Their appearance and construction, all the wheels were the same. They were like a wheel within a wheel. Well, now that's weird. And when they went in any of their four directions without turning as they went. And the living creatures went, the wheels went beside them, and when the living creatures rose from the earth, the wheels rose. Whenever the Spirit wanted to go, they went, and the wheels rose among them. So this is all weird. So, you know, how's all this? Ezekiel's seeing it turn. Now, when you get to John, and some of these other guys that write about this, they're going to talk about these four living creatures. One had a face like a man. One had a face like an ox. One had a face like a lion. And one had a face like an eagle. And what I meant to do before I got here tonight was to take a box and print that on all the sides, and it would make a better illustration than what I'm going to show you right now. But if, remember last week I told you, I think Ezekiel's kind of like seeing a CAD program, like on Fixer Upper when they show them on the computer, this is what and they'll turn the house all the way around, you know. I think Ezekiel was getting to see it turned all the way around. So he got to see all the sides. But if this is the lion side, and this is the eagle side, and this is the ox side, and this is the man side, then guess what Alan's going to see? He said, I don't know, because I don't remember which one he said was on that side. But that's the side you're going to see, right? And he would think this one only looks like this, right? But now Hugh back there, he's going to see that side, and he's going to say this one has a face like this. And then Bub over there is only going to see this side, and I'm only going to, you see what I'm saying? So I think some of these guys they saw what they saw. There were the four of them, and this one was looking this way, and this one was looking that way, and so they saw, you see what I'm saying? Ezekiel got to see it in motion, so he got to see the CAD program all the way from every angle. But they're talking about the same thing, so they must be seeing the same thing, right? It seems like. Then in verse 22, he says, over the heads of living creatures there was likeness of an expanse shining, an awe-inspiring crystal spread out over their heads. Remember, he talked about that bow that was spread out over their head that was shining light. Different language, but the same thing. And under the expanse their wings were stretched out straight, one toward another, and each creature had two wings covering its body, and where they went I heard the sound of their wings like a sound of a tumult. There was a voice from over their heads. Verse 26, above the expanse over their heads was likeness of a throne in appearance like sapphire. That's precious stones. That's what John saw, right? And seated above the likeness of the throne was a likeness with a human appearance. Well, that's what he said in John, wasn't it? And upward from what had the appearance of the waist, I saw as it were gleaming metal, like the appearance of fire enclosed all around, and downward from what had the appearance of the waist, I saw the appearance of fire, and there was brightness around him, Like the appearance of the bow that is in the cloud on the day of rain, so was the appearance of the brightness all around. That's what John said, right? So if John saw it, and Ezekiel saw it, and Moses saw it, and they all saw the same thing, then I would guess that's what it really is, right? This is the main part of it. When you get down to the end of the chapter 1, verse 28, such was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. And that line is what makes me believe that they had a hard time figuring out how to explain this. How do you explain the glory of the Lord? If I have a hard time explaining the Rocky Mountains or the Smoky Mountains, it'd be hard to explain the glory of the Lord, wouldn't it? Or explain these four living creatures that are so different. And Charles, if they're like Ernest T., they'd have said, who you calling a creature, right? How do you explain something like that you've never seen before? But you notice, I've been trying to point this out in Revelation, how many times he said like. It was like that. Maybe it wasn't exactly that, but that's the best ways that he could explain it. But you can tell they're explaining the same thing. Well, then you turn over to chapter 10 of Ezekiel. In Ezekiel chapter 10, he's going to talk about this vision that he has. And in chapter 10, starting in verse 1, I looked, and behold, on the expanse that was above the heads of the cherubim. Now, he didn't call them the cherubim in the first chapter, did he? What did he call them? The four living creatures. But these cherubim, he says, above them appeared something like a sapphire, in appearance like a throne. And he said to the man clothed in linen, go in among the whirling wheels underneath the cherubim. Well, remember in chapter 1, he said it was the four living creatures beside the wheels, right? So the four living creatures would be the cherubim. Again, somebody says your baby looks like a cherubim, you ought to go, well, I never, and walk away from them. And he said to the man clothed in them, go among them, fill your hands with burning coals from between the cherubim and scatter them over the city. And he went in before my eyes, and the cherubim were standing on the south side of the house. And he talks about all this that they're seeing. This is when they're going. This is the vision where he takes Ezekiel back in time before the temple was destroyed to see the sin that was there and why the Lord would leave the temple. And he's fixing to leave the temple and walk away from the house or from the temple. And he's talking about the cherubs there and the brightness of the glory of the Lord, verse 4, and the sound of their wings like the voice of God Almighty when he speaks. And then in verse 8, the cherubim appeared to have the form of a human hand under their wings. That's what he had said in chapter 1. There were four wheels beside the cherub, one beside each cherub, and they were sparkling. And he talks about the wheel within the wheel and all of that. But then you notice down in verse 14, he says, and every one had four faces. The first face was the face of a cherub. The second face was a human face. The third, the face of a lion. The fourth, the face of an eagle. So evidently that ox face looked like what a cherub looked like. So if somebody says your baby looks like a cherub, they're saying it looks like an ox, I guess. And the cherubim mounted up. These were the living creatures that I saw by the Chebar Canal. Well, where did he have the vision about the Chebar Canal? Go back to chapter 1 and verse 1. So how do you know, Corey, that the four living creatures are the cherubim? Because Ezekiel says these cherubim were the four living creatures. Okay? That's how we know that. And then, of course, we looked at the end of Ezekiel where he's going to say that eventually, from Ezekiel 40 to the end of the book, he's talking about a future time when there's a new heaven and a new earth and a new Jerusalem, a new city that God is going to dwell with them in if they are faithful to him. And the name of that city is, he is there. So he's writing to people that have been taken off into captivity. They are oppressed by this foreign nation, and they think God is not on his throne anymore. And in chapter 10, he reveals, yes, God has left the Holy of Holies. He's not sitting in that chair anymore because of your sin. He said, if you'll be my people, I'll be your God. And you chose to no longer be his people, so he left the house. But in chapter 1, he's showing us that God is still on his throne, right? He's still on his throne. And he's still in charge. And that's the message that he's wanting John to deliver in Revelation 4 as well. So let's look at a couple other places. If you'll turn to Isaiah, in Isaiah, go backwards a little bit, to Isaiah chapter 6. And in Isaiah chapter 6, he has a vision of the Lord. This is in the year that King Uzziah died. And notice in Isaiah chapter 6 and verse 1, he said, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up. Well, that's what the other guys have seen, right? Is the Lord sitting on his throne. And the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him stood the seraphim. Now, what's the difference in a cherubim and a seraphim? Well, it depends on whose book you're reading. They'll give you all kinds of fancy explanations, but I think what you're going to see is that the seraphim here sound a whole lot like the cherubim. Seraph means glowing. And any Hebrew word that has an I-M on the end means it's plural. So these are the glowing ones. Well, how did he describe the cherubim? They were glowing, right? So I think it's the same thing that he's talking about. But he says, above him stood the seraphim. Each had 6 wings. Well, I thought they had 4 wings. But you remember how he talked about how some of the wings were folded down by their side and some were stretched out? If he had 2 folded down by his side and 2 underneath it, maybe that's how he thought there was only 4. I don't know. But it seems like that they're talking about the same thing at least. 2 he covered his face, with 2 he covered his feet, with 2 he flew. And one called to the other and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. Well, later on in Revelation 4, guess what these living creatures are going to be saying? Holy, holy, holy. Worshiping God, saying, Holy, holy, holy. And the 4 living creatures are the cherubim, and that's the seraphim here that's doing this. The foundations of the threshold shook, and there's smoke, and there's all this power that he's seeing here. And then one of the seraphim flew to me, having in his hand a burning coal that he had taken with tongs from the altar, and he touched my mouth and said, Behold, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away. Your sin is atoned for. And I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Who's going to go for us? And so on and so forth. And he's commissioned to speak for the Lord. But Isaiah sounds like he's describing the same, he's seeing the same thing that Ezekiel saw, which sounds like the same thing that Moses saw, which sounds like the same thing John saw. I don't know how you've pictured what it's going to look like if you get to stand before the Lord on his throne, but I think we're getting a pretty good description of what it's going to. It might freak us out a little bit too, you know. All right, one last one. Turn over to Daniel, which is the other side of Ezekiel. In Daniel is going to chapter 7. He's going to see this vision of the heavenly throne room. And in Daniel chapter 7, look down at verse 9. He says, As I looked, thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow. Well, that's what John's going to say about him. And the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames. Its wheels were burning fire. Doesn't that sound like the way Ezekiel described it? And the way that Isaiah described it? And a stream of fire issued and came out before him. 1,000 served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. And I looked there because of the sound of the great words that the horn was speaking. That all sounds kind of like what John heard, right? So you put it all together, and they're using maybe different language of exactly how they're describing it, but I think all of these guys, there's too much similarity to think they're talking about something totally different. I think they're all seeing the same thing. And this is one of those cases where what John is describing is literally what he's seeing, to the best he can describe it. Does that make sense? Now, I don't know about y'all, but that's fascinating to me. That these guys were all looking in the throne room, and it's not representation anything. This is the way the throne room looks. And here's another thing that's curious about all this. If you turn over to the New Testament, to Hebrews chapter 9, and Hebrews chapter 9 is, of course, the great chapter about Jesus being our high priest and Him making the sacrifices and all that. But he begins by talking about, in chapter 9 of Hebrews, about this first covenant, which is the covenant He made with Israel. The first covenant had regulations for worship and an earthly place of holiness. Where was the earthly place of holiness? The temple, or before that, the tabernacle, okay? And he says, for a tent, that's the tabernacle, was prepared. The first section, in which the lampstand and the table and the bread of presence is called the holy place. Behind the second curtain was a second section called the most holy place, having the golden altar of incense and the altar of the covenant covered on all sides with gold. And there was a golden urn holding the manna, and Aaron's staff that budded, and the tablets of the covenant. Above it were the cherubim of glory overshadowing the mercy seat. Of these things we cannot now speak in detail. But whenever Moses was told to build the tabernacle, he was told to follow the pattern. Right? What was the pattern? Well, he says we have a earthly holy place. Where is the heavenly holy place? Wouldn't that be the throne room of God? So I really do think, and we'll look at a few more verses here in Hebrews 9 that'll back that up, but I really do think that the tabernacle and the temple were kind of like earthly versions of what the heavenly throne room of God looked like. Now that makes it pretty cool if you ask me, and what it represented. And then he talks about the priests and what they did and those kinds of things. And then if you get down to verse 11, he talks about, but when Christ appeared as a high priest, through a greater and more perfect tent, not made with hands, that is, not of this creation, he entered once for all into the holy places, not by means of blood of bulls and goats and calves, but by means of his own blood, thus securing an eternal redemption. See, those priests were going into an earthly holy place to deliver that blood for redemption. If Jesus was going into a holy place not of this creation, not made with hands, where was that? I think that was the heavenly throne room. And then he talks about the verse in all this that we're more familiar with, that the blood of bulls and goats and whatnot, then how much more the blood of Christ. But notice if you drop on down, he says he is a mediator, verse 15, of a new covenant. And then he says the first covenant was inaugurated with blood, and they had to do all these things. But look, jump down to verse 23. And he says, thus it was necessary for the copies of the heavenly things to be purified with these rites, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. I don't know if you've thought about it, but that's what he's saying in Hebrews 9, is that the tabernacle and the temple, the most holy place, That's the throne room of God. That's kind of like whenever, the boys were little and they would take their Legos and they would say, I'm going to build our house. And they would build a Lego house that kind of looked like ours, but it wasn't near as grand as our house wasn't grand. But compared to the Lego house, it was pretty grand, right? Moses took some Legos and he built a copy of the throne room. Isn't that cool? If you're not smiling right now, it's because I'm not doing a good job or you're not listening. I don't know which it is, but that's pretty cool. That's how God has been showing us. It's not just that Jesus was the priest and just that Jesus was the lamb, but all of that took place in the temple and tabernacle was foreshadowing Jesus going into the throne room of God with His blood as our high priest and the sacrifice, and making redemption for us. And that's what John saw. So, anyway, I just think that's really cool. And then, jump back over to Revelation in your books, but in Revelation chapter 4, notice, let me get over to Revelation myself. In Revelation chapter 4, in verse 9, he says, wherever the living creatures give glory and honor and thanks to Him who is seated on the throne, who lives forever and ever. Remember, I told you at the very beginning of all this that one of the big themes of Revelation is you don't worship Caesar, you worship only God. And in Ezekiel 1, and in Ezekiel 10, and in Daniel 9, and in Isaiah 6, and in Exodus 24, every one of those passages are there to emphasize that God is on His throne. And guess what John is trying to emphasize to them at this point? All these people that are under Rome's thumb that thinks God has forgotten about them, he's trying to remind them that God is on His throne. So look down at chapter 5 at verse 1. I saw on the right hand of Him who was seated on the throne. And then down at verse 7, he says, and He went and took the scroll from the right hand who was seated on the throne. And then down at verse 13, and I heard every creature in heaven and on earth, under the earth and the sea, and all that is in them, saying to Him who sits on the throne and the Lamb. And then chapter 6, and down at verse 16, calling on the mountains and rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of Him who is seated on the throne. And then in chapter 7, down at verse 10, and crying out with a loud voice, salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne. And then in verse 15, therefore they are before the throne of God and serve Him day and night in His temple, and He who sits on the throne will shelter them with His presence. And it just keeps going through Revelation. The one who sits on the throne. Remember, He's the one you worship. Now, we don't have Roman oppression right now. And we're not going to be carried off into captivity, I don't think, anytime soon. Maybe. But whatever we're dealing with tonight and this week, you know who's still sitting on His throne? Is God. And when bad things and hard things and difficult things happen, sometimes our tendency is to blame Him and try to run the other direction. And the message in Revelation and in Ezekiel and in Isaiah and in Daniel is that God is on His throne. So worship Him and trust Him and follow Him. And it still may not turn out the way we want it to, but it's going to turn out the way that's best for us because He's still on His throne. Does that make sense? Now, you thought Revelation didn't mean nothing to us, did it? But it sure does. So, next week, we will be out of town, and Mr. Webb Hall, you will be in for a treat because Webb's going to teach, and he wants to jump out of Revelation and hit an Old Testament individual. I don't know if he wants me to reveal that to you, but I'm going to. You're going to study Elisha next week. And that ought to be a very interesting study indeed. So Webb's a great teacher, and that's a good subject, so you'll be blessed for that. So, but between now and 2 weeks from tonight, read Revelation chapter 4, and we will, Lord willing, get through that. Now that we've got this foundation built of all these other throne room scenes, we'll look at what John saw specifically in the throne room that he saw. Thank you, those of you that are online with us. We appreciate you joining us and hope that you will be with us in person very soon. As Gordon is turning all that off,